here's, in case anyone's just for permission and all that, I do have permission to provide some feedback on here. Let's take a listen. Okay, so let's talk about it. When playing through this, looking at your technique, there's a couple things that I noticed with this. First of all, these are my opinions on technique in general, but it might differ from what your instructor encourages you to play or other people encourage you to play. So take that with a grain of salt. So this is just based off of my own experience and whatnot, and it may completely differ from what you're told to play. Go with that, whatever it is. One of the things that I'm noticing is there's a lot of tension in the hands, whether it's with the right hand on the fulcrum or the left hand, the pinky in particular seems to be really hugged into the stick. Another thing that I'm noticing, the stick right now has it so that when you're holding this, you are cupping the water, which is a way that you can describe the technique. So the way that you're holding onto your stick is if I were to pour water into your hands, it would stay there. And with traditional grip, you don't want that. And the reason why you don't want that is because you want this to rotate back. And so you're already at almost peak rotation. So the maximum height you're gonna be able to get is like here. With traditional grip, you want to have it so that your thumb is in alignment with the rest of your forearm. Another way that you might be taught how to do this is that your wrist is in alignment with the rest of your forearm. But either way, it is not going to be turned like this so that the water would stay inside of your hand and you'd hold on to it like this. So when you're holding traditional grip, you want to make sure that you are aligning there and then making it so that you can get that full rotation out of here rather than already started with your sticks rotated back. This is immediately going to assist with your heights, with your left hand accent taps, etc., being able to get like a nice full rotation out of there, compared to if you're starting here, you're also going to get a bit of a slice. So if we take a look at it like this, if my hand is here and we're playing with it so that the water is being held, look at the slice that is on here with that, as compared to if I go like this and I rotate, I can actually get it so that the stick rotates up and down and will go guide with the stick rather than go like this where it's like coming out like this. So you're getting that slice. That's going to make it so that you have a thinner sound quality if you play that way with traditional. Now, so we'll just stick with the left hand for a moment. So I always like demonstrate match grip in my streams, but I march snare with traditional. So I do have several years experience doing that. The next thing that I recommend is right now you're making it so that you have the closed gap right here in your fingers. That's fine. Like there's no issue with that. However, if you give yourself a little bit of breathing space so that your stick actually vibrates, like if I'm holding onto it like this versus if I'm holding onto it like this, I can actually feel the stick vibrate and it makes a little bit of a hum sound, and that is actually a good thing. So you want to have a little bit of space in there so the fingers don't necessarily need to be squeezing into here to close off that gap. It just needs to be relaxed enough that it provides support, and so you're not like squeezing it and choking off a sound, which will make it so that you actually don't get a fuller sound out of the drum. Now, the right hand, a similar thing with the fulcrum. There are many ways that you can use your fulcrum. You could use the front two-finger fulcrum with like a finger approach. You could use a triangle fulcrum. You could even use the finger fulcrum with like a rotary motion, like on timpani. Like there's many different ways that you can approach the fulcrum. The way that I personally prefer to do it is to relax the index and the thumb and make it so that you can play with a nice relaxed floppy wrist. If you are squeezing with the index and the thumb, you cannot bend your wrist. So it makes it so that you're forced to use all finger technique, which if that's the technique you're going for, great. But for myself, I like to have a little bit more power because it's rudimental. So I am okay with my wrist being the primary driver of this, primary, not the only. I'm in a little bit of forearm in there to get a little bit extra power. You can still use finger for like faster speeds. Like later on, you're going to see me using finger, like especially on like the fast paradiddle versions of chug and whatnot. But for me, what I'd recommend is holding your fulcrum so that you've got two fingers and the thumb kind of like in between it. So it gives it a little bit of like a gap here. So like your finger kind of just hangs out right here. And you can actually practice this by removing your index finger and just like playing with the index finger off the stick. And then eventually just gently wrap it around there. And that's how you can get used to that approach. Now, another thing that I'm noticing with the technique on here is you're playing with more of a Germanic approach so that you have a flat wrist right here, as opposed to like the French approach where you have thumb up and perpendicular to the floor. What I would recommend is going with the more American approach, which is kind of in between the two. So if we have German here, it's flat. So French is here is like thumb straight up. And then to the side of that, like in between the two, is an American approach where we have like a slight slope with this. And this will also help with being able to get, relax the hands a little bit more and get a little bit more power out of it, as opposed to playing with this completely flat approach with what I'm seeing right here. So the other day you asked about some flam accents. So the flam accents, the grace notes are still raising up a little bit on there. So that's okay. You'll just want to slowly start to lower those. So wherever your starting position is, the grace note for rudimental percussion almost always will just go from rest position into the head as opposed to lifting up. So you're not going to want to have flam accents like that. So what I recommend doing is slowing this down and really focusing on that technique so that you can get the hands nice and low for those taps and make it so the grace notes do not raise at all when you are working on this. So the flam taps are actually rushing. So the first phrase we have, it's kind of going like that. So that's an exaggerated version of what you're doing. So the second note of the flam tap is actually coming in too early. The way that that particular exercise is written out, if I remember correctly, from the Fresh Perspectives book by Murray Gussick, and I think Casella also wrote some stuff in there. The way it's written out is there's actually accents on the second note, as opposed to just an accent on the first note. So really try and bring that note up and make it so that it's slightly later than it currently is. So right now the second note's coming in too early. So I'd actually slow this thing down. Maybe even slower this. And really just make sure that second note is not rushed in there. And that'll help out with the phrasings of that. Etc. Now let's talk about the second half of that. The flam drag part. Whenever you're doing that, make sure that those diddles are a little bit more open than they currently are. So I think I talked about that with you in another stream about how I work on the diddles, but really just focus on slowing those down and making those accents nice and full for the flam taps, big, but relax. So don't like squeeze it in there, etc. I think it may be on page 2. I haven't seen the music for this in a long time. Really focus on getting even heights on those back-to-backs. I forget if those are patty fla-flas or foo bars, but you know what I'm talking about because you know the exercise. So focus on getting same height for that without raising up that grace note. And that last part, the 5-stroke into the paradiddle diddle, lower those taps even more than they are. The distinction between the accents and taps are vague. They're not as pronounced as they could be, so really lower those. Let's give it one more listen, but this is just kind of my first impressions of it. But again, you're doing a lot of good things, but because you asked me to provide some feedback for you, I'm hoping this is helpful for your own playing. Another thing that I recommend is probably about 80% of your time should be spent practicing this particular exercise slower than you're doing right here. I don't know, 10% of the time around performance tempo, and then maybe 5 to 10%-ish playing faster than you should. So the majority of your time should be like at least half of that speed that you're currently playing at. So that way you can really refine keeping those grace notes down, keeping those diddles with the correct interpretation and not like crushing them, and making sure that your accents are even with like both of the back-to-back flams, keeping the diddles roll. The diddles low, I can't speak. And then just really relaxing your hands. Another thing that I noticed here with your thumb is you have a little bit of like, let me see if I can show this to you. So the thumb is a little bit turned in like this. It's got what some people call like a hitchhiker's thumb. I don't know if that's an inappropriate term, so apologies if it is. But you want to make sure that you're not putting a ton of pressure on here and that you're getting too much of a curve by pulling it too close in. Just relax your thumb and let it just like hang naturally. Just kind of like rest there, as opposed to squeezing it in too much and putting too much tension on here. So again, I think you're trying to have too much of a closed grip for my particular taste with technique, which focuses on just playing nice and relaxed and whatnot. Is German grip bad? No. So it's just a different way of playing. There are many ways to play, and it serves different purposes. But for myself, I get more speed and power using the American slope as opposed to the flat. It will slow you down, in my opinion, in the long run. It's harder to use finger, and it's harder to get power if you're using German grip. Instructor likes the way a wide stance looks, most comfortable. You can still have the wide stance, but it's just like you can even do a French wide stance. Like this. You don't have to have it flat. We were taught that we should be able to have like a little box here. We had flat and our arm was out quite a bit, but you can still change the angle of your wrist, even having your arm completely out. So it doesn't change anything about this particular angle and the stance like that. But it will, in my opinion, slow you down and make it so it doesn't make as much power out of it as being able to do the American grip. So every single technique that you use is going to have an affordance and a constraint. As an example, with French grip, you can play faster with finger technique than you can with like a German grip. However, you don't get to play as much power as the other grips. With German, for me, it's not as fast as like being able to combine a little bit of finger in there with like the American grip. They all have their trade-offs. They're great at some things and worse at other things. It just depends on the line that you're playing on. Everyone should match each other so you can get the same kind of sound quality. But if you're playing on like drum set or something like marimba, you can change your grip just to get different sound qualities out of it. And like you can play one way and then switch over to another and then switch over to another, however you want. You can play Julie Spencer technique where you flip your wrist like this. Like, it doesn't matter. But when it's drumline, you gotta line up. A year and a half into playing, better than I was. Significantly better. I probably couldn't play at that speed until year 3. That's probably a good estimate. I provided a lot of information there, and I don't mean that as like, hey, you're doing bad. It's just, I wanted to give you enough stuff that you could work on for a while, but no critique of your abilities, especially for a year and a half. Yeah, that's great. So back when I used to teach elementary band, I had a student come up to me and be like, why don't you ever tell us that we sound good? And I'm like, because you don't. But if you continue to practice months from now, a year or 2 from now, you will. I'm not going to give you a false praise and be like, yeah, that sounded great, like a dying gazelle. Cool. Good job, class. Yes, you're doing really good for that amount of time playing, but there's always more things to work on and whatnot. I have sometimes a bad tendency of just focusing on those things to work on without giving the praise. So apologies if it came across as just critique. I know I just did that for a few minutes in a row. You're very welcome. Just being genuinely honest with it. If I thought your amount of progress was bad, I would tell you. For that amount of time. I have had some students where I'm like, it's clear you're not practicing. If you want to be the best, which is what you say, you're going to have to like tenfold the amount of practice you're doing, kind of a thing. Had to have those conversations sometimes, and they were uncomfortable, but that's just the reality of things. But for you, yeah, you're doing good. Keep it up. I know some people have played for several years who could not play Flammus at that speed. You're very welcome. Again, I hope it's helpful in some way. Just keep at it. Know that it takes an extensive amount of time to get good at something when it comes to the drums, and you're already like well on the path. You got hands, you got chops, you're doing good. So keep it up, but just like continue to refine. Pick one thing each day that you're gonna work on, and hopefully that gives you enough stuff to like work on for like the next month or 2. Don't expect to like all of a sudden have all that improved by the end of the day or the next week, etc.